Hello, and welcome back to Let's Talk America, a podcast from the Jewish Chronicle, which explores the race for the White House through a Jewish lens. I'm Josh Kaplan, filling in for Jake Wallace-Simons this week, and today we're joined, as always, by Josh Kraushaar, the editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider in Washington, D.C., for a double Josh special. So, Josh, I thought we'd start off by the sort of biggest news this week, which was Kamala Harris's VP pick of Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor. There was a lot of speculation, especially among sort of Jewish American politicians and people like that I follow, that Shapiro was down to the last two, but ultimately he wasn't picked, perhaps because of his Jewish identity. Where do you kind of sit on that side of it?
Well, first, it's a triple Josh special because we're talking about Josh Shapiro, probably not just one of the most high-profile Jewish politicians in the United States, but one of the most prominent Joshes in American politics. So good to be with you, Josh. Look, I don't think we always look at everything through the pro-Israel. When we're talking about politics, we're looking at it through a Jewish lens and the issues very, very relevant to the Jewish community. Israel, Josh Shapiro's outspoken criticism of the anti-Semitism at the campus protests, his outspoken proudness of his Judaism, of being supportive of Israel, that was a factor in the decision-making process. Not the most important factor, but the reality is there is a faction of the Democratic Party, Josh, that is virulently anti-Israel. And that's a new development over the last 10, 20 years in Democratic Party politics. It's not close to a majority of the Democratic Party. It's, what was once a fringe is now a small faction. And Kamala Harris's campaign and Democratic Party officials were concerned that if they picked Josh Shapiro, one of the most politically talented options she had as a running mate, that you would have division at the convention. You would have louder protests. You could have the prospect that you could have delegates booing the Jewish running mate for Kamala Harris. That would have been ugly. It would have been problematic politically for the vice president. And, I think I know it was not the most important factor, but it was a factor in the thinking of the Harris campaign.
But his position on Israel, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's not that dissimilar to the other people that they're putting forward. Mark Kelly and Tim Walz, who got it, have also, been, I would say, kind of in the same position on him since the war started, right?
That's right. I mean, look, most Democrats are pro-Israel. One other story we may discuss on the podcast is we saw a very anti-Israel lawmaker get defeated by a pro-Israel Democrat just among Democratic voters in the city of St. Louis this week. Most Democrats are pro-Israel. Most Democrats, if you look at their voting record, if you look at their history, are supportive broadly of Israel, even if they have criticisms of, say, Bibi Netanyahu, or they have disagreements over Israeli war policy against Hamas. There's generally a broad support, an overwhelming majority of support for Israel versus Hamas, or certainly Hamas and the Palestinians. Now, look, I think if you ask a lot of folks in the Jewish community, Josh Shapiro passes the Kishkas test. There's no question that he has deep-seated principles. He spoke out loudly. He stood up against the anti-Semitism taking place on campuses. He spoke up against Liz McGill's testimony. Liz McGill's the former president of the University of Pennsylvania, when anti-Semitism was running rampant on that campus, and he spoke out against her testimony on Capitol Hill, which really enraged the far left. Right? He's spoken out in support of Israel. He's criticized. He called Bibi Netanyahu the worst leader Israel's ever had, but he's been a stalwart supporter of Israel, and he's close to the Jewish community. So look, there's no question Tim Walz has a pretty pro-Israel record from his time in the House. He has close relationships with the Jewish community in Minnesota from his time as governor. Now there's some. I think you could scrutinize some of his record. He's said nice things about Ilhan Omar, the Minnesota Democrat who is very anti-Israel. That's party politics. You're keeping the big tent together. But yeah, Tim Walz is broadly a pro-Israel progressive. Josh Shapiro is a pro-Israel moderate. There's not a whole lot of difference in their overall records.
And you mentioned there a little bit about party unity. It seems since Biden dropped out, the Democratic Party has been more unified than they've been, I don't know, for years, right? Everybody seems to be rallying around Kamala. And it kind of feels like this decision was a kind of easy way to keep that positive momentum going, avoid having difficult conversations, even if, it may have consequences for winning Pennsylvania?
The instinct in both parties, Josh, is play to the base, energize your base, even if it means you can win more persuadable voters, more moderate voters by making a more centrist pick. JD Vance, not someone who's helping Donald Trump move the political needle, right? He's a guy that is MAGA through and through. He excites parts of the base. Don Jr. was his big champion, but that was the pick Trump made. He could have picked Marco Rubio. He could have picked Glenn Youngkin. He could have picked someone a little more moderate who could move the needle in a swing state. He went with the base. He kept the party united at the expense of winning new voters. I don't think that's smart politics, frankly, but that's the way American politics has operated in the last 10, 15 years, that politicians feel it's much more important to keep the base in the big tent, even if it means part of this new base is this faction of anti-Israel extremists, the Squad, right? The very small number of lawmakers in the House that have made anti-Semitic comments, that are virulently anti-Israel. There's only 7 of them now 5. Now that you have Bowman and Cori Bush who lost in races, but they have a seat at the table now, whereas they didn't 20 years ago. And that was a factor, I think, in the Democratic Party's thinking, where Tim Walz is someone who got everyone from AOC to Joe Manchin, one of the most conservative Democrats, saying nice things. John Fetterman, who's a very pro-Israel Democrat, said really great things about Tim Walz. Didn't get along all that well with Josh Shapiro. So I think when Democrats looked at this pick fundamentally, it was actually a little bit more than just Israel and Middle East policy. It was about who can I pick to get the left wing of the party and the moderate wing of the party on the same page.
And I think, you saw a lot of the kind of ugliness with the sort of Genocide Josh stuff, and I think that kind of maybe exposed them to this slight risk there. But there was also another piece of analysis that I saw that Josh Shapiro, on a sort of personal level, is not great at playing a number 2. And there were concerns that he might try and, outshine the top of the ticket, and there may be a sort of incompatible personality there. He might be too similar to Kamala, whereas, Tim Walz has got this folksy thing. I mean, I don't know how much you know Josh Shapiro as an individual, but do you get a sense that his ambition could kind of put him in conflict with Harris?
I honestly think that's self-serving spin after the fact to explain why you didn't pick Josh Shapiro as your running mate. Look at the history of presidential tickets in American history. Joe Biden didn't get along great with Barack Obama. That was not a natural partnership. It took a little time for that to work out. Mike Pence and Donald Trump were not natural friends. They weren't. And if you look at the overall history of these running, usually they don't have a close personal relationship with. Usually these tickets are made for cold political reasons, that they offer you an opportunity to brand a ticket in a certain way. They offer you the opportunity to win a certain state, like Josh Shapiro, I think would have helped Kamala Harris win Pennsylvania. That was a choice she made, not to go for the chance in a swing state or improve chances in a swing state over someone she felt more personally comfortable with. Now, look, I do think there is some merit to the case that Josh, I think you were alluding to, that Josh Shapiro is a guy who plays well in the suburbs. He's a guy who's moderate, who's from suburban Philadelphia. If you're looking for the suburban vote or trying to do even better with the suburban vote, Josh Shapiro makes a lot of sense. Tim Walz is from a rural town in Nebraska. He codes very blue collar. He's blue collar. Football coach, right? Served in the military. His record is getting scrutinized, but he served for 2 decades in the Army National Guard. So there is a cultural difference between the two, and I think Harris felt that it was more important to play or maybe improve her standing with blue-collar voters in the Midwest rather than sort of the swing moderate voters that Shapiro is so strong with.
And I was actually looking up the other day that there was, when Bibi was in Washington, there was a memorial service for Joe Lieberman, who obviously was the first, VP pick, Jewish VP pick on a national ticket. Do you think in the sort of, 24 years since Joe Lieberman and Al Gore, it's become harder to be a national Jewish politician in America, given the sort of growth in anti-Israel feeling from the fringe to the slightly more mainstream part of the Democrats?
So number one, anti-Semitism is on the rise across the world, but in the United States to a point that we wouldn't have imagined. I don't think in 2000 when Joe Lieberman was tapped by Al Gore as his running mate. look, a lot of it is social media. A lot of it is that we're just seeing stuff online from fringe actors that stuff that would never have been taken seriously when you actually had gatekeepers, when you actually had adults in the room, kind of saying this is crazy, it's untrue, it's extreme. Now that stuff is all out there on Twitter and TikTok and all, on the internet, and it's whoever screams the loudest gets a voice, and that's had a deleterious impact for Jews, for the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism has spread with that no holds barred type of discourse, the kind of the platforming of these radical views on both left and right. I don't think, I think like the mainstream majority in both parties overwhelmingly is philo-Semitic. I don't think, I think frankly that a lot of politicians worry too much about alienating the far left or the far right. And you look at some of these primaries, Josh, for instance, two of the most anti-Israel lawmakers in closed Democratic primaries, where only Democrats could vote, ousted some of the most radical anti-Israel lawmakers, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, over the last 2 months. That's the moderate mainstream. That's the silent majority, even within the Democratic Party base. But yes, I mean, I don't think many political operatives would have worried about like a 5% fringe. There's always been small factions of radicals or people on the far left or the far right. But that 5%, that 10% uncommitted, the anti-Israel faction in the party, they're very loud. They're on social media and they make their presence known. And a loud 5%, a loud 10% can really kind of shape the perceptions of where things are headed in your party, even if they're far from the majority, far from the mainstream.
Yeah, and I think, looking back, I mean, I was about 6 years old when Joe Lieberman ran for the White House. But looking back at some of the things, it seemed to be the worry with him was that his Judaism may interfere with his ability to do the job, right? He was Shomer Shabbat, and they were like, will we have a vice president that can't work on Saturdays? Whereas it feels like now, the big question mark for Josh Shapiro was not with his faith interfere, it was, does his faith mean that he is biased about Israel and therefore can't be trusted for the job? So I think it's a switching almost from Judaism as a faith to Judaism as like a thing that means you can't be trusted on foreign policy.
Well, so Josh, 2000 was the first election I voted in. I remember the Liebermania very well, the Jewish community certainly. There was no doubt. Ask any analyst in American politics. Joe Lieberman's faith, his outspoken pride in his Judaism, was a big political asset for it. Al Gore came this close to winning the election, but you look at the kind of precinct by precinct data, how close Florida was, where he moved the needle. He won over a whole lot of skeptics, and there wasn't a whole lot of. He was probably one of the most universally celebrated running mate choices in my lifetime. So there was being faithful, being religious, being observant. That was an asset. That was at a time, by the way, Josh, when more Americans were religious generally. The cultural change over the last 25 years is we've become a more secular country. The Democratic base is overwhelming. It's much more secular than it was 25 years ago. And I think that's sort of and that's mixed in with a lot of the anti-Israel. And yes, there has been anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic views that have been out in the open from some pretty radical, extreme voices that I wouldn't necessarily draw attention to, but it wasn't just about anti-Israel. It wasn't just about Shapiro's position on Israel. There was these social media, attacks on Shapiro for going to Jewish day school, and all kinds of slurs and just total misinformation along those lines. So there was a smear campaign that attacked the governor for his religion, for his Jewish religion, and that's something I don't think you would have seen, and it wouldn't have gotten purchased like it did in 2024 when Joe Lieberman was on the national ticket.
And it was interesting as well because I think after the Tim Walz pick was unveiled, there was a bit of a celebration moment for the sort of left-wing people that had called for Josh Shapiro, a little bit of the sort of celebration of the people behind the smear campaign, the very sort of anti-Israel part of the Democratic Party. And then I thought what was interesting is that yesterday in Michigan, when Kamala Harris did a speech, they were booing her because she was refusing to meet with the uncommitted people there, and it kind of made me think that is there anything that kind of would make this group of Democrats happy? Is there anything could she she's obviously not going to go and adopt all of their policy positions, but they couldn't even celebrate the win of not getting Shapiro picks for very long, and suddenly they're already getting angry again.
Look, there are two options in politics. You can essentially try to have a big tent view, triangulate everyone within the party, and try to find the middle. Stick your finger and try to find the middle of where everyone who identifies on the left is. 20 years ago, there wasn't any real anti-Israel movement, any anti-Semitism really to speak of in the Democratic Party. Now you have a faction, 5-10% say, that is virulently anti-Israel. You could, as a Democratic leader, have what Bill Clinton did in 1992. It was called a Sister Soldier moment in American politics, where he attacked. It was a rapper who said some just really extremist language, and he spoke at a conference and condemned it in front of the base of the party. Said this is unacceptable. This is not where the Democratic Party stands. And he won points from Democrats. He won points from independents. He even won points from Republicans for standing up against extremism. The big picture, looking ahead to the bigger, broader electorate. The tendency now, as we've been talking about, is to kind of accommodate those views, to indulge. Maybe they don't agree with them, but they indulge those views within the parties. The Republicans have done it on their side, certainly in the age of Donald Trump, and Democrats have been now doing it when it comes to these anti-Israel, very radical voices in their own party, and that's been the instinct. Even among people who are very pro-Israel, they feel the need to kind of keep silent. Not criticize Rashida Tlaib, not criticize Cori Bush, right? They'll ignore them or they'll indulge them, and that leads to larger problems, and that could create a problem at the convention, certainly for the Democrats in Chicago.
As in, you kind of give them an inch, they'll take a mile, sort of thing.
It's like it's like appeasement. It's sort of the equivalent of like foreign policy. When you appease someone, they only take advantage of you, and that's what we've seen with these loud protests. You mentioned the Michigan speech that Kamala Harris gave this week, where she met with an anti-Israel group very briefly on the rope line at this event. I think tried to kind of win them over, tried to at least kind of placate them, and they interrupted her speech. They heckled her during her speech, and she said that if you want to, she shouted them down basically. But that's what happens when you give an inch, like you said, they try to take more.
And I guess I also wanted to turn to Cori Bush's primary. There seems to be a tendency in a certain type of left-wing politician when they're defeated that they blame all of the world's evils on AIPAC, right? And they said, we're going to destroy AIPAC, and AIPAC, the reason why we lost, and real voters don't think like this. AIPAC did put a lot of money into those races, but is it fair to say that those races were won by AIPAC?
It's certainly, you need to have in a primary campaign enough resources to get your message out. So without AIPAC, without the money and that they help pour into these campaigns, you might have the best message and the most effective message in the world, but if you can't raise enough money, if you're a challenger, it's hard for you to get your message out. So what AIPAC did is sort of even the playing field, and frankly, in the case of the Cori Bush race, I think they outspent overall the pro-Bush forces. But Bush had a lot. AIPAC doesn't play in every race where there's a critic of Israel. They only play where you have Democrats that are so far to the extremes that they're vulnerable for a whole host of reasons. And frankly, the advertising campaign wasn't about Israel. It was about Cori Bush going to the left of Joe Biden on infrastructure. Cori Bush supporting defunding the police, which is not popular in the black community in St. Louis. Like, they want safety, they want police on the streets, right? She had ethical issues. She was under investigation for criminal misconduct, for misusing her campaign funds. So Jamal Bowman too, he pulled the fire alarm on Capitol Hill that everyone covered, and it was a scandal. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor. So he had legal issues in addition to the political problems. So AIPAC, the money only works when there's already a groundswell of opposition within the Democratic Party to these lawmakers' extremism. So they take advantage of what's going on the ground. And Bush and Bowman both were so radical and so corrupt and said so many anti-Semitic things that they created an opening for very, very strong candidates to run against them and take advantage of that political environment.
And do you think this will kind of minimize the power of the squad as kind of like a movement that can get attention and a movement that can get interviews on cable news and dominate the airwaves? Do you think this is marking the beginning of the end of that kind of little pocket of the Democratic Party?
No, it's not the end. It's not the beginning. Maybe it's the beginning of I think they've peaked. They peaked in 2018, 2020, and now the mainstream has fought back. And part of the problem, I think, in sort of electing centrists, electing mainstream lawmakers, is you may have the majority of the public, but the people who actually are going to spend their time on social media or going to protests and really like just getting riled up about everything are the people on the far left and the far right. So that is still going to be a reality in our politics, but certainly defeating two of the I think 7 squad members. That's almost what 20. That's almost 25%. Is that my math? A little over a quarter of the squad. That's a pretty good. That's a pretty good track record. And I think that a lot of. I mean, I wrote a column a couple months ago that even though AIPAC is a pro-Israel group and they're supporting pro-Israel candidates on both sides, there's a strong correlation between pro-Israel candidates and moderate mainstream candidates. So by putting money in these primaries, not just against the squad members, but against in these open races where no one knows who the candidates are, and there's an pro-Israel candidate and an anti-Israel candidate, getting engaged in some of those races too has made a big difference. Where the more moderate candidates have been doing better than the far left candidates that have been running in those races.
And I was actually reading a story on Jewish Insider about activists attacking the AIPAC headquarters. And it seems for a certain type of person, AIPAC is the kind of great devil in American politics, and there's nothing that they can't pin on AIPAC. And I mean, it just seems, from my reading of it, is that they are a lobby group like a billion other lobby groups in America that have a popular amount of support for them, and they operate within the law just like any other lobby group, right?
That's right. I mean, that's part of the democratic process. That is what's great about democracy. Everyone has a chance to participate and get involved in campaigns. They've been responding to, I think, the growing grassroots energy on the left, and they've become a sort of a centrist counter to that, and it's had an impact in these primaries. Look, the far left, the squad, they've been trying to characterize and caricature AIPAC as like a handmaiden of right-wing Republicans. I don't think anyone would call Wesley Bell, a progressive prosecutor in St. Louis County, African American, a right-wing Republican. His record is he was a civil rights leader throughout his public life. I don't think anyone would call George Latimer, a very center-left Westchester County executive, one of the most popular officials in Westchester County, as some right-wing Republican. I mean, it doesn't pass. The problem is that, and one of the successes of AIPAC has been they've helped recruit really popular, well-known individuals in these communities that clearly are not right-wing Republicans, right? So they have the stature, they have the profile to rebut the slurs, and they've done so effectively.
And just mentioning sort of right-wing Republicans, I'm quite conscious that we have managed to make it this far and without speaking about Trump and Vance. And it seems like J.D. Vance seemed to play up the Jewish thing a little bit and kind of suggest that, Kamala Harris may have been motivated by anti-Semitism. And then an interesting thing I thought is that, that might strike some people as slightly hypocritical, given that the Republican Party has a far less successful record of Jews at the top of the party than Democrats, right?
Yeah. Look, it's J.D. Vance has been an interesting figure. He certainly has not helped the Trump ticket politically since Trump made him his running mate. He is from the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, and at the same time, he gave a speech to an isolationist think tank, frankly, that has some anti-Israel elements to it as well, called the Quincy Institute. And he gave a pro-Israel speech before he was selected as Donald Trump's running mate. There's a lot of concern that if you don't believe in America's role in the world, America's involvement in international affairs, would a Trump-Vance administration, even if they support Israel, would they do what the Biden administration is doing in helping deter Iran from their planned attack against Israel as we speak, right? There is a lot of worry that this isolationism, even though many Republicans who subscribe to this worldview also generally are pro-Israel or are expressing support for Israel, but there's a little disconnect in terms of the consistency there. And I think Vance, I don't think, calling Harris anti-Semitic. I mean, I think some of the attacks on Democrats for picking Walz over Shapiro have been a little bit ham-handed. I don't think they really understand the Jewish community and sort of the nuances of the issues at play. So certainly they're trying to score some political points here, but the reality is in the United States, 60-70% of the Jewish community is Democratic. The battles that we're talking about are often waged within the Democratic Party. There are only 2 congressional Republicans that are Jewish. So, this is not. I mean, there's a reason why Israel has been seen as a bipartisan issue, and rightly so, because if it became a partisan issue, and there's some worry that it's becoming one, that would have deleterious consequences for the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Yeah, definitely, and I think there's a bit of a, I don't know if it's a question mark, but I think, definitely since Trump was defeated in 2020, he's spoken in a more sort of isolationist tone, but again, has still been quite strong on Israel, and I guess the MAGA movement in itself has a bit of a streak of some parts of the Republican Party aren't too keen on Ukraine, and it feels like some parts of the Republican Party could be convinced in an isolationist way to kind of ignore Israel, or at the very least, take a minimal role in ending the conflict, right?
Well, look at the convention, the Republican convention. I think it's sort of, we wrote a story at Jewish Insider from Milwaukee about the Republican Party's split screen on anti-Semitism. To their credit, and I think you wouldn't see a party convention that spent as much time speaking out against anti-Semitism publicly. Shabbos Kestenbaum, a student at Harvard who's been harassed for being openly Jewish, spoke. You had the Nutra family of one of the hostages spoke, and very movingly. It was a very, very powerful moment at the Republican convention. They really did showcase their willingness to go after anti-Semitism and to remember and deal with the plight of the hostages. At the same time, you also had Tucker Carlson featured on Thursday night, and you can he certainly made a statement that I don't think would be considered friendly to Jews or Israel. You have Mark Robinson, the Republican gubernatorial nominee in North Carolina, who is pro-Israel ostensibly, but he has a whole laundry list of anti-Semitic Facebook posts from not that long ago, who got a primetime spot. And then there are a couple others, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. So the Republican Party certainly has been pretty universal in its support for Israel, but they also have some baggage, and they also have their own issues with the far right of the Republican Party in a way that we hadn't seen in quite some time either. So this is a bipartisan challenge. It goes back to the fact that extremists on both sides are empowered, and social media gives them a voice that they didn't have maybe 20 years ago. So that's a challenge. That's not just a Republican, or it's not just a Democratic Party challenge. It's one that is across our body politic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you kind of always notice that the sort of horseshoe theory of politics kind of ends with Jews being attacked, however you look at it. So I think we like to stay pretty centrist, where it feels a little bit safer. But yeah,
yep.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thanks so much for speaking to me, Josh. We'll be back next time with potentially less Joshes, but the same level of Jewish analysis. So yeah, thank you, Josh, for your time.
Thanks, Josh. We'll talk to you next time.